6 black seamen sailed on the Essex. 4 of them were placed in the same boat, the one with the least command authority, farthest from rank and accountability. That boat is the first whole boat to vanish from the surviving record. The famous Essex story begins with a whale. The harder story begins with a list. The Essex was not sailing into a story. She was sailing into a business. She left Nantucket in August 1819, bound for the Pacific whaling grounds, and the men who crewed her were working sailors on a working ship. 20 men left with her, including 6 black seamen. Among them were William Bond and Samuel Reed, listed by name and station, by the plain administrative fact of their presence aboard. No one in port treated the departure as prophecy. The Essex sailed into an ordinary danger, the kind every ship in the Pacific whaling trade accepted. By November 1820, she was deep enough into the Pacific that routine rescue was not coming. There are 2 survivor accounts at the center of the Essex story. Owen Chase was the first mate. He survived and published his narrative in 1821, close enough to the wreck to feel immediate, far enough from the boats to have already become a shaped account. Thomas Nickerson was the cabin boy, 14 or 15 years old when the Essex went down. He wrote around 1876 as an old man, looking back across more than 50 years. His manuscript was not published until 1984. Chase is indispensable. He is not a transparent camera. The most reliable portions of his account are those with no obvious reason for shaping. The provisions list, the boat roster, the navigational decisions, the named deaths. Where Chase explains motivations or characterizes the officers' choices in ways that make them look sound, that is where the reader has to slow down. Nickerson matters because he saw the ship from below officer rank. He was the youngest man aboard, and his memory preserves the texture of ordinary days before the disaster. The social world of 20 men at close quarters, the things that do not make it into an officer's formal account. That specificity only someone who lived it can supply. But he wrote more than 50 years after the wreck. 50 years is long enough for the mind to smooth what was jagged, add coherence to chaos, and accommodate versions of events already circulating in public. Nickerson is not a stronger authority than Chase. He is a later, different, carefully limited one, valuable for what he noticed, held at distance for what he remembered. Memory is not a camera. Between those 2 accounts sits a plainer document, the boat list. It does not explain itself. It records in the manner of working ship's paper which men were assigned to which vessel. That roster is harder to read than either survivor narrative because it has no narrator and makes no excuses. The whale strike is the famous part. The boat list is the harder document. George Pollard commanded the Essex. He was young for command, but the record does not need him to be a villain. The question is not whether he suffered. He did. The question is what his decisions produced for the men who had no say in them. Not culpability, consequence. On November 20th, 1820, a sperm whale struck the Essex in the Central Pacific. Chase records it with the directness of a man who watched it and lived. The whale struck once, came around, and struck again, driving under the bow hard enough to start the ship filling. She went down quickly enough that clearing her and 3 small whaleboats required control, not panic. The first miracle was not courage, it was equipment. Chase lists what the men salvaged: quadrants, navigators, compasses, sails, water, food. The boats were whaleboats, light, fast, built to chase animals across open water, never meant to be homes. But they floated, the instruments allowed navigation, and the provisions meant there was time before the arithmetic of starvation closed in. Every barrel of water was a specific number of days. Every compass was direction that could be verified rather than guessed. The inventory mattered. It also had a limit, and the men in those boats knew what the limit was before they had gone 20 miles from where the Essex sank. The nearest land was to the west. The officers chose not to sail there. The Marquesas Islands were closest. The Society Islands were next. Both lay within a range the three open boats could have attempted. The officers, according to Chase, feared them. His language is the language of the era. Islands inhabited by peoples whose character was, in the officer's estimation, dangerous. That fear turned geography into a trap. The nearest land was ruled out not by cartography, but by assumption. The officers chose south and then east, toward the coast of Chile or Peru. South America was thousands of miles away. The islands to the west were not. They had the tools of navigation. What they lacked was the chart that would have made the Western Islands usable in their minds. They were sailing inside a cultural assumption, built from whaling captain tradition, that was not an accurate guide to the actual risk of making landfall in the Marquesas. The plan was logical on its own terms. Sail south to the variable wind latitudes, then force the boats east toward the South American coast. A mathematical gamble made by men who understood celestial reckoning in open ocean, who could calculate latitude and correct their heading under a clear sky. What the calculation could not correct was the premise. The fear was not navigational, it was cultural, and once it was accepted as a given, it dropped out of the reasoning entirely. The officers were not debating whether to fear the Marquesas. They had already decided. They were planning around a conclusion they had arrived at before the whale struck. On its own terms, that plan added thousands of miles, many weeks, and radically worsened the odds of survival for every man in those boats. The whale opened the emergency. The route decision determined how long it lasted. Now the boat list. Pollard commanded the first boat, with Samuel Reed among his crew. Chase commanded the second, with Richard Peterson. The third boat was under Matthew Joy, the second mate. Joy's boat carried 4 of the 6 black seamen from the Essex: Lawson Thomas, Charles Shorter, Isaiah Shepard, and William Bond. 2 black seamen between the captain's and first mate's boats, 1 in each. 4 in the second mate's boat, the one with the least command authority, the farthest from rank and accountability. In 20 men split across 3 boats, this is not a random scatter. It is a concentration. The roster does not explain itself. It does not say who arranged it or what logic, if any, produced this distribution. It is not a document of motives. It is a document of outcomes. A cautious reading does not require a motive to name a pattern. It requires only that the pattern be named as what it is. After the wreck, the 3 boats agreed to keep company. Chase records the logic plainly. 3 boats in the open Pacific were safer together than scattered. If one sprang a leak, the others could help. If one capsized, there were witnesses. If one navigator lost his reckoning, another could correct it. In boats this small, survival was governed by proximity. Help, food, water, labor, witness, everything depended on who was close enough to share it. Companionship was not comfort. It was navigation, repair, witness, and rescue chance. It was also a kind of governance, the only one available to men with no port, no authority above them, and a diminishing horizon in every direction. The agreement was real. The ocean's capacity to override it was also real. On December 9th, the captain's boat went missing in heavy weather. It reappeared later. These boats could lose each other in darkness and bad weather without anyone choosing to abandon anyone. Separation was a risk that existed independent of loyalty. The Pacific was simply large enough and dark enough. The boats were not lifeboats in any modern sense. Every leak had to be solved with labor, because a leak unaddressed in a boat that size was not an inconvenience, it was a race. Every hour spent bailing was an hour not spent sleeping, not spent recovering whatever physical margin remained. The boats reached an island in December. Chase calls it Ducie. Modern identifications generally place the episode on Henderson Island, a raised coral island with fresh water and some food resources. The difference is not a trick of historiography. It is a reminder that the survivors were navigating from incomplete knowledge and exhausted bodies. The island offered a pause. it was not rescue. William Wright, Thomas Chappell, and Seth Weeks chose the island over the boats. The records give this as a choice made by men who looked at the open water and decided the island was the better gamble. It was solid ground. A different arithmetic made by men who could see that open water had become another name for diminishing odds. Their eventual rescue keeps the episode from pretending there was only one kind of endurance in the Essex story. After the boats leave the island, the record no longer moves as one. This is where the Essex story stops being a single thread. After the December departure, it breaks, because the boats separated, because the surviving accounts come only from those who survived, and because some of those boats were never heard from at all. From here, the story has to be reconstructed, vessel by vessel, with whole lives crossing into silence between entries. Matthew Joy died on January 10th. The second mate had been weakening for weeks, the accumulated cost of exposure and shrinking rations. Command of the third boat passed to Obed Hendricks. A new commander did not change what the third boat was: a stressed, open vessel carrying the heaviest concentration of black crew from the original 20, already placed at the margin of the survival structure from the first hour after the wreck. The record does not say Hendricks was incompetent. It says Joy died, Hendricks took over, and what followed in that boat is among the least documented portions of the entire Essex account. The third boat had the weakest command authority at the wreck site and lost even that while the worst of the journey was still ahead. Provisions ran out over time, not suddenly. Water rations that seemed reasonable at the wreck became, across weeks, a slow diminishment the men could calculate and could not stop. Bodies fail in specific ways when they are not fed and not watered. First strength, then judgment. The record does not dramatize this. It states it in the plain language of men who were watching the arithmetic close around them and writing down what they saw. Only after that pressure is named does the account say what it says. Men who died in the boats were used as food by the survivors. It was a circumstance produced by a chain of decisions, none of which were made by the men who were dying. Chase's appended account names the dead black seamen in sequence. Lawson Thomas died first, Charles Shorter, Isaiah Shepard, Samuel Reed, who had been in Pollard's boat. The order matters not because it proves any calculated plan, but because it shows which men were already concentrated in the most vulnerable position. 4 of the 6 black seamen in the third boat, under the least experienced command, in the boat that would lose that commander first. The record names them. That is not nothing. It is also not everything, because the account that names them fails to explain the distribution that put them there. That silence is part of what the boat list is telling us. The second mate's boat, the one that began with 4 of the 6 black crewmen, is the first whole boat to leave the record for good. The other boats are tracked through rescue. The third boat stops appearing. It only tells us which boat did not come back. Pollard and Charles Ramsdell were picked up by the whaling ship Dauphin after more than 90 days in an open boat. Chase survived with Benjamin Lawrence and Thomas Nickerson. The men left on Henderson were eventually rescued by a passing vessel. The popular Essex story usually has 3 magnets: the whale strike, the cannibalism, and the shadow of Moby-Dick. All 3 belong in any honest account. Herman Melville knew the Chase narrative, and the Essex became the factual foundation for a novel that grew far more famous than the historical event. But those magnets point outward, toward myth and metaphor. Moby-Dick belongs to the afterlife of the Essex. This episode is about the documents before the myth hardened. My read is that the wrong choice was already made before the worst hunger began. The survival story of the Essex is usually treated as a story about extremity. What happens when people have nothing left? That framing is not wrong, but it focuses on the end of the chain rather than the beginning. The decision that extended the survival from weeks to months was made at the wreck site in the first hours after the Essex went under. The West-East decision, the fear of inhabited islands, the choice of South America. Once the officers' council made the nearest islands into an imagined danger and the far coast into a plan, the boats were sailing inside a cultural assumption that was not based on accurate information. That assumption radically worsened the odds for everyone aboard. The whale opened the emergency. The route decision determined how long it lasted and who it took. The boat list is a document of distribution. 6 black seamen sailed on the Essex. 2 were split between the captain's and first mate's boats. 4 were placed in the third boat, under the second mate, under the lowest command authority. The roster puts 4 of them in that boat and lets that boat become the first whole vessel to vanish from the surviving account. Whether this distribution was the product of deliberate calculation, unreflective convention, or the social structure of Nantucket whaling culture in 1820, the document does not say. It does not explain it. It does not excuse it. It records it. And what it records is a pattern, not a conspiracy, not a verdict. A pattern, plain, documented, and unanswered. The whale made the emergency. A sperm whale struck a Nantucket whaleship twice and sank it on November 20th, 1820, in the Central Pacific. The animal's agency in that moment was real. It has understandably dominated the public memory of the Essex for 2 centuries. But the whale did not choose the routes south and east. The whale did not distribute the crew between 3 boats or assign 4 of 6 black seamen to the vessel with the lowest command authority, or let the third boat leave the record before the journey ended. Those things followed the whale strike through decisions that were human in origin, even when lethal in outcome. Pollard's route made the emergency longer. The boat list shows who was placed closest to the silence. The whale opened the Essex story. The boat list shows how men finished writing it.